Hello, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for joining us on this very important topic. Today, we'll be discussing how to best prepare for aquaculture feed certification, in particular, the new Aquaculture Stewardship Council certification for feed mills. Before we begin, we just have a few housekeeping items to share with you all for this webinar. We encourage you all to participate with the question function in GoToWebinar. We will be compiling questions as we go, so feel free to drop those in there. And we also have some real-time polling that we'll be doing throughout the presentation, so that'll be interactive and helpful here, just getting to know the audience. At the end, we'll have a 10 to 15-minute question and answer session after about a 45-minute presentation. So that'll be a great time to get further engaged and address questions that people have in the audience. We are recording this and we'll be distributing this to all attendees. So if you registered for the webinar or you're attending now and listening in, we will be following up automatically with additional resources, the presentation, the slides. And overall, just so everyone's aware, the presentation is slated to go for about an hour and 15 minutes. But if we need additional time, we have blocked an hour and a half. So the agenda, what are we going to talk about today? Before we get started, we're just going to orient you all, share a little bit about SCS Global Services and our support for the seafood industry and aquaculture industry. In addition, we're going to share some of the benefits of getting ASC feed certification. That'll be about 15 minutes of that background. And then we're going to unpack some of the ASC feed standard itself. Our team has been going to work on that, implemented, and we're first to the market on that in 2024. So we have some interesting insights to share with you all, including what the timeline, the process is like, some of the challenges and key issues that we've been experiencing from a CAB and an auditing body perspective. And like I said, we're going to have a Q&A at the end. I just want to take the opportunity to introduce myself and my colleagues as well. My name is Brian Ehlers. I'm a technical sales manager for sustainable seafood here at SCS Global Services, and I support business development for supporting the seafood industry globally. I'm joined by my colleague, Adam Didino. Adam is our director of aquaculture, and he has been heavily immersed with overseeing this new offering to support aquafeed globally and the ASC feed standard as well. And we're very lucky to be joined by Juan Aguirre. Juan is our lead feed auditor that has been obviously very much involved in carrying out these audits, going on site, visiting a lot of feed mills, and has over 30 years experience with the aquaculture industry as well. So we're very lucky to have Juan joining us too. And Juan will be available on the Q&A, so stay tuned. Now, just to take the temperature and get an understanding of the audience, if you wouldn't mind, please just indicate which answer best describes your connection to the seafood industry in this poll. You see we have 4 options here. Give everyone about 15, 20 seconds or so to respond, and then we'll share the results. Okay, excellent. So pretty even spread, and about a third of the audience actually works at feed mill operations, which is obviously the key audience here. But in addition to that, farms and other support for the broader supply chain is super important. So this is great. It's great to see. Thank you, everyone. So before we dive into the ASC feed standard itself and some of our initial results on that body of work, a little bit about SCS Global Services. So we are a global leader in sustainability certifications, consulting, standards development, and we have been involved in that leadership for over 40 years now. We've been conducting certifications with over 15,000 clients now globally, and have been doing that work in over 125 countries. So pretty broad network and body of work over the years. In particular, we've been working with the global seafood industry for over 25 years now. Our network actually consists of these four entities. SCS Global Services is our founding company. That's what we've mostly focused on today. SCS Global does a lot of the certifications, auditing, verification work. We also have SCS Standards that writes standards for many different sectors globally. SCS Standards is a nonprofit. We have SCS Consulting Services that does actually a lot of HACCP training and consulting for the seafood industry. Is really important for the seafood industry, but also does other consulting services around ESG and other things of the like. And then we also have a new innovative platform that we just launched called the Global Heat Reduction Initiative. So if you want to find out more about those other entities, feel free to reach out. But for today, the purposes of today's presentation will be largely focused on our work that we've been doing here at SCS Global. Our global presence of personnel, auditors, and offices to support our work with the seafood industry is quite extensive. This requires highly credible, responsive, and effective services in support of our partners globally, which is particularly important, as you all know, for being an auditing partner to the aquaculture industry and seafood industry. It's highly globalized, and so a lot of our work brings us to, in particular, Latin America, North America, and Asia Pacific, and other regions as well. Just to give you a sense of some of the work that we've been doing with the industry and aquaculture sector in particular, we continue to partner with several key players in both wild capture and farm-raised seafood production, and other companies up and down the supply chain as well. As I mentioned, our efforts in Latin America, North America, and Asia Pacific region have been more involved, but we do be doing some work in Europe and in Africa as well. And this includes some of our more recent efforts on aquafeed, including our work with Biomar and Cargill and others. So just super high level, our core services and solutions for the seafood industry are fairly comprehensive, and they span across these four pillars that you see here. So in the upper right, over 25 years ago, we started a lot of our work partnering with seafood industry around food safety, around Global Food Safety Initiative, GFSI, and that includes our work with doing auditing under schemes like SQF, BRCGS, and of course, doing HACCP work as well. Since certifying the world's first MSC fishery in March of 2000, West Australia rock lobster, we've really expanded our portfolio of work with environmental sustainability, adding ASC well over 5 years ago, and in particular, our fair trade wild capture fishery certification, and more recently too, some work with fair trade for aquaculture there's been an uptick in that as well, which is very interesting. We recently applied for the Best Aquaculture Practices BAP certification in November, and we're hoping to have that up and running in June later this year. And in addition, the other two pillars in the lower part of this figure, you'll see social responsibility. We do a lot of work. I mentioned fair trade, but we do a lot of work with SMETA, and that's been particularly important to the industry in recent years. And also, there's been a significant increase in inquiries around carbon and decarbonization and verifying and validating those types of claims. So that's another area, a growing area of work that we do. But for today's conversation, of course, we'll be focusing on our new service offering for ASC feed certification. So another poll for the audience. As it relates to ASC feed certification in particular, how many of you in the audience are familiar with this new requirement the ASC came out with that's effective this October 31st, 2025? Go ahead and answer the question here. And as many of you may or may not know, all ASC certified product, finfish, shrimp, and others that require feed for production will have to have the feed certified as well. So those feed inputs, those feed mills have to be certified themselves, have to have a certificate by this October. So very much in the near future. Okay, great. So half the audience is knowledgeable requirement, and the other half no or not sure. So very good to continue. There's an opportunity to educate here. So hopefully we can, hopefully this webinar is of help to you all. So I'm about to turn things over to my colleague Adam Didino to do a deeper dive on the ASC feed standard and the process. But it's important to touch on why is this important. You know, as we just learned, we have this deadline. So October 31st of this year, feed suppliers and farmers, you know, you don't want to be caught up in non-compliance and potentially lose your ASC claim on your shrimp or finfish or whatever products are being raised to meet market demand. This provides assurances to the market, you know, ensuring best practices for feed mills on an area of supply chain, an area of the supply chain that's had some difficulty in providing those assurances around labor practices, ingredient sourcing, to make sure that those the whole feed production is more socially responsible and environmentally sustainable. This does provide, you know, additional risk abatement too. There's growing concerns around raw marine ingredient sourcing, fish meal, fish oils. There's concerns around deforestation, labor practices, and so for a particularly large buyers and a large, you know, a huge segment of the seafood industry and the market, this reputational risk that this helps provide additional assurances and risk abatement around those types of issues. As we all know, the feed is very expensive too. It's the biggest cost center for the aquaculture industry and for production of finfish and shrimp. And so when something is quite expensive, it's important that it's, you know, that resource is handled as best as possible, related to cost, related to quality of the product, safety of the product, and ensuring that it's responsibly produced. So this presents an opportunity for feed mills to really, I would say, fine tune and optimize their production in general. And in addition, you know, having those benefits around sustainability and social claims and ensuring market access. There is a due diligence requirement. Aquafeed ingredient sourcing has been relatively opaque and a challenging component for aquaculture and seafood supply chains. It's like that first mile of the supply chain, as they say, right? And so, as we'll discuss in more detail, these due diligence requirements really put a lot more responsibility on the feed mills, on producers to improve provenance assurance and credibility around their sourcing of ingredients for their feed. So there are other potential benefits to getting certified too. And just as a reminder, if you're a feed mill, of course, you want to make sure that you maintain that relationship with your customers, the farms that are buying your feed. But it also might open up new markets. If there are areas like Europe or perhaps in the US market where there's ASC certified farms, they're going to need more feed and more sources of feed. So it might present new opportunities to totally tap into a new market that you weren't previously supplying to in your region. The ASC, Adam will share more about this, but the ASC feed standard has performance indicators around legal compliance. So a significant component to going through this process is also making sure that you have a positive result and that your production is meets the mark in terms of the jurisdiction where you're operating and the proper authorities related to legality. It also contributes to sustainability impact. Let's not forget that going through this process, this enables feed producers to distinguish themselves in the marketplace, contribute to sustainability impact, be more data driven to be able to make those claims. And marine ingredients, for example, often come from very regulated fisheries or maybe certified fisheries. We'll talk about the different options for sourcing with raw marine ingredients, but we also have terrestrial ingredients that need to come from deforestation-free supply chains, like soy and other ingredients. So the code of conduct that gets put in place with those different sources of ingredients is super important. In addition to just, I would say, lowering your environmental footprint, that could include, energy, greenhouse gases, water, residues, recycling, other things that are kind of baked into the feed standard. There is perhaps an even bigger direct benefit where the feed mill production is allowed to, basically helps them identify carbon footprint hotspots, isolate some of those issues, because there's a lot of ingredients, up to 50 ingredients sometimes going into feed mills. So isolating some of those ingredients that are attributed to higher carbon or carbon footprint, isolating those and making adjustments can really help lower your costs and your overall production. So that's a nice benefit to this as well. As some of you know, there's other standards out there around feed production. The BAP, Best Aquaculture Practices program, has had a feed standard for quite some time. And one of the benefits, I would say, to the ASC feed standard in particular that we've observed, that Adam will explain more about in depth, is that feed standard isn't, for ASC, it essentially allows more flexibility around the production that's occurring at the feed mill, and whether a portion or percentage of that production is certified feed going to certified farms, rather than having to certify the entire facility and the 100% feed production that's occurring on site, which is what the BAP standard currently requires for feed. So it does allow some accommodations and flexibility, a more incremental approach to feed mills kind of going to the market and tackling some of these challenges and making progress in the years to come. We have been very busy. As I mentioned, Adam and his team led this effort to go to the market in 2024, and we've learned a great deal during that time. Adam, Juan Aguirre, and our team of auditors. We've conducted several pre-assessments and now certifications of many companies, some of them listed here, including Vimifos, who's the first feed mill to get certified globally under the ASC feed standard with their 3 sites. And we've been working with a lot of other partners as well. So excited to share more, some of our initial insights. And at this time, I'd like to turn things over to my colleague, Adam Dedino, Director of Aquaculture here at SES, who has been deeply immersed in this issue and this effort, and has some insights to share with you all. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Brian. Can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, well, thank you everybody for joining today. So for the rest of this webinar, we're going to dive into some of the key components of the standard, the audit process, some challenging issues in the standard. How do we make the audits go smoothly? We're really just going to kind of talk about the standard from an auditor's perspective, the certifier's perspective. It is a complicated standard. There's a lot of information in it. We don't have the time today during this webinar to break everything down in detail, but we're trying to highlight some of the key issues and the key things to know from our perspective as the certifiers, and particularly now that we've been doing this work for a year. What have we seen come up, and what do we really want to emphasize? So we're talking about how to prepare for feed mills. If you're a farm, this will be useful if you're talking with your mills and they're getting ready to certify. Hopefully you'll understand the standard and the language a little bit better. And yeah, so we'll jump into it by starting with some of the key components. So the ASC feed standard, it's a long document. If any of you have opened it and read it so far, there's a lot going on. And we even have this nice graphic that we got from the ASC that kind of has their key components to the standard, which is on the right. But really, at the end of the day, everything in the feed standard comes back to social, legal, and environmental responsibility. And this social, legal, and environmental is about both the mill and its operations wherever it is sited, but also the supply chain. And so we'll talk about the supply chain on the next slide a little bit with the due diligence. But just remember, everything we're doing, it's all coming back to demonstrating low risk for social, legal, and environmental. And so, that's as straightforward as is the mill operating with the permits in place, right? Showing legal compliance in place where the mill is operating. But then, as we'll discuss later, it's also talking about the supply chain. Are the ingredients coming from sources where they're legally being fished and whatnot? So this is really important, as there's so much going on in the feed standard, but just at the end of the day, everything is coming back to showing positive performance for social, legal, environmental. The next thing I want to talk about is the models for certification. This is really important because this impacts how we prepare as auditors and also how the mills will prepare. So the ASC has 3 models for certification, although it's really 2 if you see the third one is mixed, so it's a mixture of the first 2. But the models of certification are mass balance and segregation. So the mass balance approach is, it was kind of what Brian was talking about earlier, where the whole mill, like every product coming out of the mill, doesn't need to be certified. And the idea with the mass balance approach is whatever percent of eligible ingredients coming to the mill is the percent of eligible feed product you can sell from the mill. So for example, if your mill is only able to source 30% of ingredients that meet the requirements of the ASC standard for low risk, then only 30% of the feed can be sold as certified. This is actually the most common model we've seen in our first year of work. And it's a really nice approach because the ASC is not sacrificing the level of rigor they want to add to their standard. They're not going to say, the mill needs to get certified by meeting these certain KPIs. They're saying this is exactly what the ingredients need to show. They need to show low risk for social, legal, environmental, and whatever you can source, that's what you can sell. If you can't source all of your feed ingredients meeting our standard, that's okay. We understand that the market is not there yet and that it's not really possible to source ingredients from the supply chain that meet the ASC standard. And so they have the mass balance approach. And it's also nice because you don't need detailed segregation and traceability systems within the mill, which you do for the next model, which is the segregation. So the segregation model is, it's about traceability and segregation within the mill. This is if your mill has the ability to say the ingredients coming in, we can track it through the mill, and we can have confidence that whatever aquafeed product we're selling, that we can confirm that those are the ingredients that meet the ASC standard. So we have certifiable ingredients coming in, we can track it through the mill, and then whatever is coming out, we have confidence in. When we're preparing, there are certain indicators in the standard that are applicable to the mass balance, applicable to segregation, and not applicable to the other. The segregation model also has a traceability requirement. So one of the things we have to do as auditors is we have to show up to the mill and confirm that you do have the proper traceability and segregation systems in place. And so it's really important to understand, this is one of the first things we look at as we're preparing for an audit, because it will change how we interact with the mill and how we pursue audit evidence and conduct the audit. So if you're a mill preparing, just make sure you pay attention to what model you're going to be pursuing, and pay attention to which indicators are applicable or not, because it really does change the number of indicators and the types of indicators that we're viewing during the audit. So the last thing you want to do is prepare to show compliance to a bunch of indicators that are not actually applicable because you're doing the other model. And then the mixed is exactly what it sounds like. It's a mixture of both the mass balance and the segregation. To be honest, we haven't seen this one yet come up. I'm sure it's out there. We are prepared to handle a mixed model when it comes to us, but to this date, we have not seen any applicants coming through mixed. So I assume it's fairly rare, but yeah, we just haven't seen it yet. Okay, so the next topic I want to discuss is the due diligence requirements. So there's a lot that goes into the ASC standards, but at the core of the standard is the due diligence requirements. So there are not as many indicators for the due diligence requirements as there are, say, confirming the social performance of the mill and the workers. But the due diligence, while there's not as many indicators in the standard, it probably makes up most of the work that goes into complying with the ASC standard. And it's most of the critical work because it's actually what allows you to say what ingredients are eligible to be certified and sold, whether it's the mass balance approach, what percent of ingredients are eligible, or if it's the segregation model, say what ingredients are we using and tracking through the mill to then get to our final aquafeed product. So the due diligence requirement, it is comprehensive. It is how the ASC is handling the complexity of the supply chain and the number of ingredients that go into the feed mill without requiring auditors to conduct like a 4-month-long audit. So as we all know, the supply chain for the feed industry, it's large, it's complicated. There's many ingredients coming from different sources. And the ASC wants to make sure that all ingredients used in aquafeed, almost all, there's a couple conditions for why ingredients might not be eligible, say it's less than 1%. But for the most part, all ingredients that are used in the feed production meet the ASC standards for low risk across social, environmental, and legal. And so this is the due diligence requirement. So the due diligence requirement puts the onus on the mill to assess their supply chain. And it sets methodology requirements. So there's a process that needs to be followed during the due diligence. It's not overly prescriptive, but there are some steps that need to be followed. And there's some competency requirements as well. So the mill will be required to have, whether it's competent people at the mill who can do the due diligence or outside consultants or help. There are some competency requirements. So what this essentially means is, as auditors, when we show up, we don't have to review the entire supply chain and every single ingredient. We review that the methodology has been done, so you're following the proper methodology, the steps have been taken properly, and the person doing this work has the proper competency. And that is what gives us assurance that the due diligence has been done properly. We'll sample the due diligence and look at a couple in depth, but if we had to look at every ingredient from every source in depth, the audit would take 4 months, and that would be a nightmare for everybody. So the due diligence really is at the heart of the standard for how do we have assurance that the ingredients being sourced in the feed are actually meeting the conditions of low risk across the 3 categories of social, environmental, and legal. So how do we demonstrate low risk across these categories? Well, the due diligence methodology has 4 pathways that can be followed. The 4 are what's listed here on the slide: the country scorecard, the sectoral analysis, ingredient manufacturer assessment, and certification. The first and the fourth are similar and the easiest path, but they're similar in the sense that work has already been done to demonstrate low risk for a certain category. So with the country scorecard, this is a document that ASC publishes that has a list of countries, and it has social, legal, environmental, for both the marine ingredients and the plant ingredients. And you can go down and find the country of origin for this product. And the ASC has already done some work to determine if the risk factor. So say you're sourcing fish meal from Norway. If you go through the country scorecard, you might see, oh great, Norway, primary marine ingredients, social risk low. So there, just by where the origin, the country of origin of the ingredient, if the ASC says that country is low risk, you have then determined low risk. So the country scorecard is very straightforward and a very easy pathway to follow because a lot of that work has been done. Similarly for certification. So the 4th pathway is certification. So for example, if we're talking about marine ingredients, we have the MSC fisheries certification. So if you're sourcing marine ingredients from a fishery that's certified by the Marine Stewardship Council Fisheries Standard, then this will put that ingredient as low risk for legal and environmental. Now, importantly, the MSC standard doesn't have a social component. So this gets to one of the complexities of the due diligence is one ingredient might need to have more than one pathway. One pathway might be used to show social, low risk on the social side, but a different pathway might be needed to show legal and environmental. So this is where it gets complicated because we start to think about the number of ingredients used in feed, and then we need to show social, legal, and environmental risk levels for all of the ingredients for both marine and terrestrial. It starts to add up to be a lot of work. So this is why it's really one of the more complicated and core parts of the standard. But of course, I hope you can understand like why that's so important. And one of the most critical parts of the standard is because this is where the actual real work on understanding the supply chain and the ingredients risk level is done. The middle 2 pathways are a little more complicated. So it's a sectoral analysis and ingredient manufacturer assessment. And in these pathways, if the scorecard and certification is not had, it's not the end of the world. An analysis can be done on the origin of the ingredient, and a conclusion can be made that it is low risk, if it is indeed low risk, and there's some methodology and competency requirements around these as well. These are a little more complicated because it is an analysis that the feed mill needs to undertake. whether you have a competent person in-house or you're outsourcing that work to a consultant. It is work that needs to be done, that can potentially be time consuming. And there's also the competency requirements. So there's a good chance that just the existing people at the mill might not have the competency requirements to do a sectoral analysis on social issues of a fishery. So this is one of the more challenging parts of the due diligence. The ingredient manufacturer assessment is a little similar to the sectoral analysis, where there's an assessment that needs to be done. But in this situation, if you're sourcing ingredients from a manufacturer, then it's about working with the manufacturer to determine low risk. It's similar to the sectorial analysis in many ways, but there's just this extra step where there needs to be a relationship between the mill and the manufacturer who's providing ingredients to do this analysis to determine low risk. So together across these 4 pathways, if you can show an ingredient has low risk for social, legal, and environmental, then we can say that that ingredient is eligible to be ASC certified, whether it's segregation or the mass balance approach. We need to see low risk across the board, and then we could sell that as an ASC certifiable ingredient. Okay, so I want to touch on the ASC Program Center really quickly. So there is a lot of information tied to the ASC standard. And so as you're preparing to be audited, or if you're just looking to learn more about the standard and all the components to it, there's information scattered in different places. But the ASC has taken all the information and they've made one central repository where you can find this information. We have a link in the PowerPoint which will be sent out to everybody, so you can find the link here. But I believe Brian is also going to drop a link to the Program Center into the chat. So yes, it looks like he's done that. So you should be able to access the Program Center through that link as well. You can always do just an internet search. If you're really struggling, reach out to us. We're happy to help point you in the right direction. But the Program Center is great for many reasons. But the big thing, like I said, is it's just a central repository of all the documentation. So what is included in the Program Center is the standard, which makes sense. So there'll always be the most up-to-date version of the standard. But there's also the interpretation manual, which is a really important document. So we have the standard where we have all the indicators listed and what is the requirement of each indicator. But the ASC has this really lofty goal of setting the bar of what is responsible aquaculture and aquafeed production globally. So because of that, they have to write their standard in a way that is understandable to the widest audience possible, but there's always room to misunderstand an indicator, misinterpret. We can debate over the meaning of words. And so the interpretation manual is really important because every indicator in the standard will have a matching indicator in the interpretation manual. So say 2.2.1 in the standard. If you're confused on what that indicator is saying, you can go to the interpretation manual and you can find the background and the rationale on the indicator. So every indicator, we have background and rationale for what is the intent and the purpose of the indicator. And this is really important because it's really what helps clarify like the objective and the goal of every indicator. And this is really important because when we're maybe a little confused on what we're supposed to be looking at with a certain indicator, we can go to the interpretation manual and that will hopefully clarify it. So if you are a mill and you're preparing to be audited and you're looking at an indicator and you're saying, I really don't know what I'm supposed to do with this, the interpretation manual is a great place to go because it should help highlight, what is the intent? What is the spirit of the standard? What are we trying to achieve? And that is very helpful to kind of keep moving forward as we're working to implement the standard. And it's helpful for us auditors as well. This is the first year, we're kind of on to the second year of the standard. There's still a lot to learn, and we misinterpret things as well. And so for us, we use the interpretation manual quite a bit to make sure we're following the intent of the standard as much as possible. So the next two documents are really important process documents. So we've listed the requirements of the unit of certification and the certification and accreditation requirements, what we call the RUOC and the CAR. These are very similar documents, they just have a different audience. So the first document is the requirement for the unit of certifications. That's a document that's aimed at the feed mills. So whatever is going to be covered by the certificate that's eventually issued is the unit of certification. And there are rules of engagement with the ASC system, and that's all what's covered in this requirements of unit of certification document. The certification accreditation requirement, it's all the same rules, but the audience is us, the certifiers. So it's telling us how we engage with the system. You don't need to understand both of the documents. If you understand one, you'll understand the rules. And it's things as simple as like what's in the contract between the certifier and the feed mill. There's also things that define the timelines, or what is the severity of the non-performances? What's the timeline to close non-performances? What's the timeline for surveillance audits and recertification audits? So we have the standard itself, which is the technical content, how does the mill perform? But we have the RUOC in the car, which is how do we engage with the system? And these are requirements that we must follow as well. And so definitely, as you're preparing, make sure you open up one of these documents and you just familiarize yourself with the system around the standard. There's the vocabulary portal. So the vocabulary portal is important for quite a few reasons, but the biggest thing is every industry has its own jargon. Aquaculture, aquafeed production is no different. So they define a lot of terms through the standards, but they also put definitions in depending on how the ASC views a certain definition. So I think one example might be young worker. There's limits to what young workers can do in a feed mill. Different countries, different schemes, different regions might define the age of a young worker differently, but the ASC, they have their idea of the age of a young worker, and so that's another important part of the vocabulary platform, is it's not just what are all the terms being used, but it also helps define how does the ASC view specific terms and elements that will be auditing. And then lastly, we have the control document master list, and this is a really important repository of documents for so many reasons. I listed just two examples of what you can find here, like the ASC feeds list of accepted schemes and the country scorecard. So if you remember from the last slide, that ties back to the first and fourth pathway. So if you're going through and you're trying to find what schemes show low risk for ingredients in the due diligence, that document will be found in the controlled document master list. These documents are not part of the standard. They are part of the controlled document master list for a very specific reason, and that is the ASC has a standard revision process that it's a long process. There's stakeholder involvement, there's transparency, there's draft standards, and it's a whole process to update a standard. But they want some documents to be a little more agile, that can be updated a little more quickly, that then will impact the standard. So, for example, the ASC country scorecard. If the ASC goes through and they determine a certain country has dropped a risk level, maybe they were medium on social, now they're low, they can go through and they can update that scorecard. So definitely make sure as you're preparing, you're familiar with all the supplemental information and documents, but don't rely on that information through the subsequent years. You'll get certified, you'll get your certificate, and then we'll have surveillance audits and recertification audits. The standard might not change that quickly, but these documents in the control master list can change a lot more quickly. So just make sure you're paying attention to the version numbers. It's not going to be too big of an issue this year if we're preparing, but in the next year, the next 3 years, next 5 years, just make sure as you prepare for each audit, you're paying attention to the version numbers of what's in the control document master list versus what you've been referencing, what you might have on file, what you used for the previous audit. But yeah, this is a new thing the ASC just launched, the Program Center. And it's been really nice so far. So I think this is a really nice addition, because we'll talk about it later. But one of the challenges of the standard is there is information scattered in different places. Okay, so I want to touch on the timeline a little bit. So there is a sprint to get certified. So as Brian informed you all through the second poll, there is this deadline of October 31st, 2025. And this is the date that the ASC expects all certified farms to be sourcing ASC certified feed. So that's not very far from now, especially if we look at the bottom of the slide and we see the whole process takes approximately 4 months. So we're kind of running out of time. And a lot of things, a lot of the questions we're getting from feed mills is, okay, what's the timeline and what's the process? So the timeline starts with reaching out to us and our sales team, and we'll start the application process, which actually, tying back to the RUOC in the car, we have a specific application process we have to follow, questions we have to ask, information we have to gather. So we go through the application process, we scope the mill and the audit, we get a sense of the duration, the number of employees, just how long the audit time is going to take, and we build a proposal. And once we agree to terms, then we'll sign the contract and we'll jump into the actual audit process itself. So the ASC has some timelines around the audit process, and the first one is the announcement period. So the ASC requires us to have a minimum of 42 days between when we announce an audit and we go on site. The purpose of this is for stakeholder engagement and transparency. The ASC takes stakeholder engagement very seriously. It's a core part of their principles. And because of this, when we announce an audit to the ASC, they put it on their website so any interested party can go and they can take a look and say, oh, this feed mill has an audit on these dates. And they're able to provide input to us, the auditors, if they would choose. During this period, we also email the stakeholders we have that we're aware of directly and say, hey, we're doing this audit. If you'd like to comment, please let us know. We have a list of stakeholders just from our years of experience, but we also, during the application process, we look to collect some information from the mill directly on any stakeholders they might be aware of, local communities, so on and so forth. So that's all happening during this audit announcement period. It's a minimum of 42 days. There's no maximum. We can announce an audit to start in 2 years from now. We would prefer not to, but there's nothing to say we can't. So that's the announcement period. So after the announcement period, oh, and then one more thing on the announcement period. It's really important to remember this because we are in this crunch to get certified, that we cannot expedite the audit time. You know, you can come to us tomorrow and say we want the audit next week, and we would say, unfortunately, it's going to be 42 days from whenever we go under contract. So that's one of the real issues. So make sure you engage with us early and often if you are worried about getting certified on time. Okay, so we have the audit announcement period, and then we go on site. So the site visit, it can change depending on the mill, the location, the number of people. Typically, the audits are 2 to 3 days for a single site. If we're doing multiple sites together, say you have a multi-site certificate where you have 2 neighboring mills and you want them on one certificate, it will still be 2 to 3 days per site. This can change. It can be more, it can be less. This is something we'll scope during the application process, and by the time we announce the audit, we'll know exactly how many days we're planning to be on site. So once the site visit is over, we start the next stage, which is the draft report generation. So that's on our end as the certifier. We have to write a draft report. We have 42 days to do so, following the ASC required timelines. And we submit that draft report to the ASC for public comment. And so once they post the draft report for public comment, this starts the final stage, which is the final report and the certificate generation. And there are 2 stages to the final stage. So the first stage is public comment. And this is just like the announcement goes onto the ASC website, so stakeholders are aware of the upcoming audit. The draft report goes with the initial findings, so stakeholders can have a chance to look at it and review it and provide comments. So that's the first 15 days of the final period is public comment, and we cannot issue a certificate in that first 15 days. We have to get out of the public comment period, and if stakeholders have provided input, then we have to address it. If they haven't, then we can jump straight to working on the final report and certificate. About the stakeholder process, I will say, so far with the feed standard, we have not seen a lot of stakeholder engagement. I think it's probably 2 parts. One is it's a new standard, and so a lot of stakeholders aren't as familiar with it. But the other is, I think the mills being in a building, in a warehouse, in an industrial park, it has a much different relationship with the environment than a farm does, say a shrimp farm next to mangroves. So we haven't seen the same stakeholder engagement in the feed standard as we've seen in the farm standard. That might change, but so far, the stakeholder engagement has been minimal. But yeah, so once we get through the stakeholder engagement, the public comment, as soon as we can issue the final report certificate, we will. There are a couple things that can slow down this process, and we will talk about that on the next slide, please. Okay, so why do things move slowly? Why does the audit move slowly? What might delay a certificate? And this is really important because, just not to sound like a broken record, but there's a lot of mills that need to get certified by October. There's a lot of farms counting on their mills to get certified that haven't necessarily engaged with the process yet. And so it's important to know what you can do to make sure you get your certificate as quickly as possible. So one of the first issues is non-conformances. So we have 3 levels of non-conformances. We have the critical, the major, the minor. All 3 of these need to be addressed before we can issue a certificate. Importantly, the critical and majors, they have to be closed before we can issue a certificate. Minors, we can extend for up to a year if we have reasonable justification for why additional time is needed. But during the initial audit, we cannot extend critical or majors. Well, during any audit, we can't extend a critical. Once you have a certificate, majors can be extended for a couple months. But importantly, during the initial audit, criticals and majors must be closed within 3 months. Otherwise, the audit will be considered a failed audit. And if you fail an audit, that is the best way to not get a certificate quickly, because you'll have to restart the whole process. So closing non-conformances quickly will help get your certificate quickly. If you wait till the 3-month mark to close criticals and majors, well, we can't issue the certificate before that. So that's going to push us right to the end of the timelines. In addition to that, the number of non-conformances is a big factor. So non-conformances create additional work. Non-conformances will always occur. It is very rare for a company to go through an audit without a non-conformance. But if there's 2 or 3 non-conformances, that's a much different workload after the audit than 20 to 30 non-conformances, which we have seen before. So the number of non-conformances will really impact the speed at which we finalize the report, because we have to address all the non-conformances in the report. It also, it just creates a lot of extra work. So once we have the end of the site visit, we'll present the non-conformances. And if there's a couple non-conformances, we can work on corrective action plans and root cause analyses. The mill can fix the issue, and we can get through that pretty quickly. But like I said, if there's 20 or 30, that could become days of work for both you, the mill, and for us, the auditors, and that can really slow things down as we're trying to finalize the report. Another issue that can slow things down are variance requests. So I have a whole slide dedicated to variance requests because I believe it's an important part of the standard, or the ASC process, that is. But we cannot issue a certificate with an open variance request. So if we have to submit a VR, then we have to wait until that VR is closed before we can issue the certificate. And we'll talk about that whole process in a little bit. The other thing that's happening, and this is a bit outside of the control of the mills or SCS, the auditors, is outside review. This is a brand new standard. The ASC feed standard has been around live for a little over a year now. And there's a lot to learn. And there's a lot of review that's need to be done to make sure the companies that are doing the work, like SCS, the other certifiers, are auditing the standard correctly. So the ASC is sampling all draft reports that come in, and they're doing their own review on it. And they're making sure we're understanding the indicators, the intent, but this could potentially lead to some comments that we have to address before we issue a certificate. Similarly, we have a company called ASI. They're our accreditation body. They're the ones who are responsible for making sure SCS and other certifiers are making proper decisions and determinations and assessing compliance appropriately. And ASI is doing some review as well. This is just a natural part of the development of a brand new standard. There's a lot of extra oversight because we have a level of assurance we need to provide through the ASC claim, but that claim of environmental responsibility is only as strong as the system is. And so all this outside review really helps make sure the audits are done to the highest quality possible. But what this does do is potentially add additional work and time as we're getting close to finalizing the report. We actually had an example, I don't know, a couple months ago now, where I was getting ready to issue a feed certificate, and it was a Thursday. I was going to issue the certificate on a Friday, and midday on Thursday, I was finalizing the report, and I get an email from the ASC with a bunch of technical review comments, which I wasn't thrilled about because all of a sudden, the client, I told them everything looked good. I was going to be working on their certificate, it should be soon, and we had this little wrench thrown into our plans. Not the end of the world. I engaged with the mill, we addressed the few comments we needed to, and then we got them their certificate about a week later. So not the end of the world, but just know it's possible that additional review will come in that will require additional follow-up on our end. The next bullet point we have is lack of preparedness. This one almost doesn't need to be on the slide. I think it almost goes without saying. And this also really ties back into the number of non-conformances, because if you're not prepared, you're likely to get a lot more non-conformances, which will then slow down the process. A lack of preparedness can also slow down the audit itself. And if we have to extend an audit during the site visit, we will. We can't end the audit until we've got through all the information we need to. So if the mill's not prepared and is struggling to get us the information we need, well, that could potentially delay the closing meeting, the end of the audit, and then all the timelines from there. And then lastly, why do things move slowly? A lack of a responsible person to own the ASC feed certification. And for us, this means a number of things. So most mills we've engaged with so far, when they endeavor to achieve ASC certification, it's not one person who's doing all the work. It's too much work to implement a standard. It requires a team of people, a committee of people to work together to prepare a mill for certification. But having one person who can oversee the management system, who is familiar with all the steps you have taken to comply with the standard, is really important for a number of reasons. One, as we're preparing for the audit, it's helpful to find a time for the auditors to show up, to do the scheduling. But during the audit, having one person who can kind of shepherd the auditors through the whole process, get them to the people they need to talk to, whether it's somebody in HR or talking to the health and safety inspector, just like making sure the audit runs smoothly. Having one person who's familiar with the whole process is really important. And then also follow up with non-conformances. Having one person involved with the non-conformance follow-ups really helps streamline that on our end, and it makes it a lot easier for us to move through closing non-conformances. So we really suggest that regardless of how you're working towards achieving certification, you have one person who's kind of overseeing the whole thing, almost like a project manager, that can really then help us engage with the mill in an efficient and streamlined manner. Okay, keys to a smooth audit process. Well, in many ways, it's the flip side to what we just discussed. Being prepared and knowledgeable of the standard is really important. I think kind of goes without saying, if you want the audit to go smoothly, if you're prepared and you know what to expect, it should go smoothly. Well-organized documentation is also important. The auditors have a bunch of documentation they need to collect and then review. And if we show up and we have to spend half a day just trying to collect the documentation, well, that's not great, because then potentially we're not going to have enough time to get through reviewing all that information. So if we show up and your document is ready, all your documentation is ready to go, it's organized, the auditor says, okay, I need to see your water use records, and says, perfect, here you are, then we can really take that discovery process of identifying the documentation and shorten it down, and then we can focus on the audit and hopefully finish the audit on time and keep everything moving. Another thing that might help with the smooth audit process is a pre-assessment. We have done quite a few pre-assessments for mills in the past year. This is a really useful process if you're not 100% sure you're ready to be certified. Our pre-assessment approach is typically desk-based, so it's remote. Our auditor will connect with you through a remote medium. There'll be some document sharing, some calls to just discuss your processes, and we will do what we call like a gap analysis approach. So the pre-assessment is not about determining conformance. We're not going to say definitively, oh, you are complying with this indicator. What we are doing is we're looking for any significant gaps that would prevent certification in a significant manner. So say, for example, there's a requirement that all workers have a contract. And then there's also some requirements for what's in that contract. During a pre-assessment gap analysis, we would go and we would say, okay, do you have a contract? There is a contract, great. No gap found with the contract. We might skim it quickly to see, okay, it looks like everything's there, but that's not all the triangulation we need to do to provide an assessment of conformance or not. We need to talk to the workers to make sure they're aware of what's in the contract. And there's just several other, what we call triangulation as auditors. We need to triangulate compliance. And the pre-assessment, it's not a full triangulation, but we're just making sure there's no significant gaps. If we showed up to a desk review or a pre-assessment and we found there was no contract with workers, that's a much bigger issue. And that would be a significant gap. And we would say, okay, you need to adjust that before you're ready for certification. And the pre-assessment's nice because if there are any significant issues, you can start working on it ahead of time. And this kind of ties back to the non-conformances as well. if workers don't have a contract, that's likely a major non-performance, and you'll have 3 months to address that. Not the end of the world to get workers' contracts in 3 months. It would be wild if they didn't have contracts, but it can happen. So not the end of the world, but if you know workers need a contract, or the contract is not sufficient before the audit even starts, then you're not constrained by that 3 months. You'll have more than 3 months to get everything to where it needs to be. So the pre-assessment is very useful for identifying any significant gaps that will present real challenges to getting certified and certified quickly. The next is being proactive on non-conformance follow-up. I talked about it a little bit on the last slide. Non-conformances are a very challenging part of the audit process. Quite often we'll finish an audit and there's this big sense of relief for the people going through the audit, whether it's the mill or a farm or anybody getting audited. You've done all of this work to prepare for the audit. The auditors show up, okay, they've raised another non-conformance, but okay, we've gone through the hard part, which you have, and there's often a big sigh of relief, and people tend to relax a little bit, which is fine. If you prepare for an audit and you get through the audit, great job. You've done the hard work and you've taken the first steps, and that's so important. But you don't want to just forget about the non-conformances and say, okay, we're good, we have 3 months. You want to address the non-conformances right away. To address the non-conformance, you need to do a root cause analysis. So you have to identify why the non-conformance happened, and then you have to do a corrective action plan. So how are you going to correct the issue and make sure it doesn't happen in the future? So through this process, the requirement is that the mill, if they receive non-conformances, they have to write the root cause analysis and corrective action, and then they have to submit it to the CAB for us to review and approve. And so there's just some back and forth there. And once everything's approved, they can send us the evidence of the steps they've taken to address the corrective actions. And usually the evidence is pretty good. Sometimes we'll say, okay, we need just a little bit more. So there's always this back and forth process to close non-conformances. What we don't want is to wait till 1 week before the 3-month deadline. The earlier you can get going on the corrective action plans and root cause analyses, the more you can engage with us early and often, the easier it will be to move through the post-site visit process and get you that certificate on time. The next bullet point is becoming really, really important, which is being flexible with audit dates. I have said it quite a few times now. There is a sprint to get certified in October, and there's an issue with the ASC feed standard right now, that there's not a lot of qualified auditors out there. So the ASC farm standard has a set of requirements for farm auditors, and that requirement is experience and familiarity with aquaculture production. The feed standard similarly has the same requirement for feed production. Unfortunately, a lot of the audit pool in the ASC world doesn't have both aquaculture experience and feed production experience. So the overlap in the audit pool for ASC farm auditors and ASC feed auditors is very small. And this has put feed auditors in incredibly high demand. We have, and Brian mentioned, we have Juan Aguirre on our team. He'll be on the call later. He's a staff member who we have just prioritizing feed audits right now. We work with some other contract auditors who work with all the certifiers, but there's a lot of work coming to the auditors right now. And so the auditors are really busy, whether they're staff members, whether they're contract auditors. And we want to make sure everybody who comes to us and engages with us in the certification process, we want to get you your certificate on time. So, and on time being October 2025. So please have some flexibility with audit dates. Now, of course, we can't do an audit if key personnel are not at the mill. If there's one person who's overseeing the audit process and they have a planned vacation, well, that's not the right time for us to show up. So, there of course will be some things you cannot be flexible about, but in general, the more flexible you can be with your audit dates, the better, the easier it will be for us to schedule an audit and to make sure we start moving through the process to get you a certificate ahead of October. And then lastly, the last bullet point to a smooth audit process is considering a consultant. Now, I will say this, we haven't seen a lot of consultants helping with the audit process in the feed standard yet, but we see it a lot in the farm standard, and we see it a lot on other third-party standards we work with at SCS. And consultants are important for many reasons. One, they can bring industry knowledge and expertise in that maybe isn't had at the mill, but a big like a really useful part of consultants sometimes is just extra capacity. I'm sure many of us are overworked and busy and just don't have a lot of time to take on such a massive project as implementing a whole new standard and getting certified to the ASC feed standard. So consultants can be really useful, both on the industry knowledge and expertise, but also just having somebody with a little capacity, especially if you need to create documentation, procedures. If there's a lot of like raw documentation that needs to be prepared to meet the standard, that's something that could take a lot of time. So something to consider. Okay, so the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about challenges that we've seen in the past year. And these are kind of general challenges. One is kind of specific to an indicator, but the other ones are just kind of around the whole system and issues with the ASC feed standard in general. So the first is the ASC feed standard initially specified 8-hour shifts. And during our first few audits, it was abundantly clear that the ASC feed standard did not fit into a lot of industry practices of 12-hour working shifts. So the ASC has made some allowances to do this. They've submitted a VR, and I believe Brian is also going to drop that VR into the chat so you can have a read through it if you have a 12-hour shift. If you do have a 12-hour shift, that is allowed now, but there are still some additional conditions that need to be met in order to meet the 12-hour shift. And this also is another way to tie back in the interpretation manual. Like if you want to know why the ASC specified 8-hour shifts, the interpretation manual discusses that, why they think 8-hour shifts is important. But anyways, so there is an allowance for 12-hour shifts, but the conditions that the ASC has stated that allow 12-hour shifts still are not being met by all the mills we have come across, and this has created some challenges. This is an issue for a lot of reasons, but one of the issues is reorganizing the work schedule, the working hours, the shift schedules. That is not something that's easy to do. So if we get to the audit and we find you're not complying with the working hours, even if it's a 12-hour shift, if you're not meeting the allowances in the VR, it might be hard to address that within the 3 months that you need to. So if you do have 12-hour shifts, please make sure you review the VR that Brian dropped into the chat. When you engage with us, let us know as soon as possible if you have any concerns about meeting the conditions of the VR that allow these 12-hour shifts, because we want to get ahead of that. You know, it's almost like self-reporting on non-conformance. If you know it's going to be an issue, let us know, and we can start working towards the correction of that issue prior to even the on-site audit if we have to, because, you know, like I've said a ton of times, there is this deadline in October. We want to make sure you get your certificate on time and quickly, and this is one of those things that we want to be ahead of if we can. Another challenge is we are on the first version of the standard. So this, the main thing I'm trying to say here is it's not streamlined yet. So this kind of goes back to the program center being a central repository, but there's more than that. The ASC feed standard will go through the natural evolution of all standards. We've been doing this for years at SCS. We've seen so many standards launched go through the first version, the second version. Over the next few years, the standard will change, it will improve, it will tighten up. But right now, we're on the first version. So it's a little inefficient in ways. There is documentation required that's scattered in different places. Sometimes that's done with a purpose, other times it's not as important. But there's information everywhere. So as you're preparing for the audit, make sure you're paying attention to all the footnotes in the standards, the annexes, the supplemental documents, because it's easy to overlook items. And we have had non-conformance come up because there is a clarification of how to implement an indicator in, say, a footnote, and that footnote was overlooked. And so the mill was most of the way to compliance, but they missed a little item, and therefore they get a non-conformance. Not the end of the world, but just one of those little things that are making it a little challenging, leading to additional non-conformances during this first year. So just please make sure you're paying attention to all the little details that go into the standard. And there are a lot, and it is a lot to wrap your head around. But you know, that's just the state of standard development. The next issue is the due diligence evaluations are challenging. I talked about this quite a bit on the due diligence slide. I think that the big issue is when you multiply social, environmental, legal across all of the different feed ingredients and marine and terrestrial. There's just so much work that goes into the due diligence evaluations. It takes a lot of time. So if you're preparing for an audit, please don't have this be the last thing you start on. Maybe have it be the first thing you start on. They're very challenging as well. Like I was talking about, there are competency requirements. So there are specific people that you'll need to have the proper competencies just to do this work. So there's a chance that the people you have at the mill won't meet these requirements. So you might need to identify some people who can help with this. So just make sure you start on that early and you pay close attention to it. The other thing is we've seen non-conformances come in because of how complicated the due diligence are. There's plenty of room for oversight. Maybe you have 50 ingredients that you're looking at. One of them you forget to classify the risk for social. Not the end of the world, but that's a non-conformance. So there needs to be a complete due diligence for every ingredient, and that's a lot of work and just it's complicated work. So just make sure you're on top of that. But we have seen quite a few non-conformances come up because one element of the due diligence was overlooked. Not the end of the world, but it's been happening. Okay, so the last two items of challenges are not necessarily related to implementing the standard or engaging with the standard, but well, in a way it is engaging with the standard because we're looking for eligible ingredients. So currently, the amount of marine ingredients that pass the due diligence and the amount of the vegetable ingredients, particularly wheat and soy, that pass the due diligence and the due diligence requirements for non-deforestation for wheat and soy, there's a bit of a scarcity, and this is really amplified in certain regions. Certain regions have much easier access to complying ingredients than others, and this is a challenge because you need to get enough certified feed to supply to your certified farms, and if you're literally not able to supply these ingredients, well, that's going to be problematic, and it's in different ways. Maybe you can find ingredients from further places, but then your costs are going to go up. It's a big challenge. Hopefully this is something that improves over the next few years of the feed standard and the efforts being made to improve supply chains and fisheries and just raw material production. Hopefully this becomes less and less of an issue. But during this first year, we've heard from a lot of mills that they're not thrilled that the quantity of complying ingredients they have is just not where they want it to be or need it to be. So when you're going through these due diligences, don't be discouraged if you start to find eligible ingredients are not quite what you're expecting. That's been a common experience. It's an issue, but it is a common experience and something that will hopefully improve over time. Okay, so the last topic I wanted to talk about is the variance request process. So the ASC scheme allows variance requests, which some schemes do, some schemes don't. It is an important part of the ASC scheme, in my opinion, and it's a really important part of a new standard. So what is a variance request? So the ASC, like I said earlier, they have just such a lofty, ambitious, and important goal of setting what is the bar for global responsibility for aquaculture production and aquafeed production. And they have to write these standards for the best practices of feed mills worldwide. But it's, they're writing it to capture most mills, but it's never going to be all mills. So there's always going to be times where there's regional nuances, there's operational nuances where the way your mill operates just doesn't fit in with the way the standard was written. And I think a good example of this is the 8-hour working hour shift issue we talked about on an earlier slide, where the standard initially said 8-hour shifts are required. We got out into the world and we found, okay, 12-hour shifts are normal. Therefore, the standard doesn't meet the practices of a lot of mills. Now, the ASC is accommodating to this issue. They're saying, okay, well, maybe your operations don't meet the standard perfectly, but if the intent of the standard is met, well, then that's room for variance requests. So in the situation with working hours, what was the intent of the 8-hour shifts? Well, it was to make sure workers had a good work-life balance. It was to make sure their wages, it wasn't a means to take advantage of wages and pay lower wages, and to make sure workplace fatigue wasn't leading to accidents. So that's why they wanted 8 hours. But the mills came and they said, okay, well, we have 12-hour shifts, but we pay a living wage. We make sure there's ample time off so workers have work-life balance, and we make sure we have many processes and steps in place to mitigate fatigue and workplace accidents. And so in that situation, an argument was able to be built to say, okay, 12 hours doesn't meet the initial want of the ASC, but it meets the intent of what they're looking to achieve, and that's just a perfect situation for the VR. So the process of a VR is to engage with SCS on the VR. This can happen before the audit starts, or this can happen after the audit concludes and a non-performance is raised. To get SCS on board with submitting a VR, essentially you just need to outline what is the issue, why can't you meet it, and why do you meet the intent of the standard? And if we agree, like, okay, we understand what the issue is, we understand that the intent is being met of the standard, then we can start down the VR process. It is the responsibility of the mill to draft the VR. SCS would review the VR and make sure it's in a place that we believe is sufficient to submit. There might be some back and forth. You might submit a VR and we'll say, okay, maybe you need to capture the intent of the standard a little bit more, and then you go back and work on the next draft until we get through and it's in a place where we submit it. Once we submit the VR to the ASC, it's in their hands to review. The review process, it varies quite a bit. It can be as short as a week or two. It can be as long as 2 or 3 months. At this point in time, the ASC is typically not going too much past 2 or 3 months to respond to a VR. But some VRs can be incredibly technical, and the more complicated and technical, the longer it will take the ASC to review. Something important to remember during the VR process is the ASC can reach out for additional clarification, more justification on why the VR is valid, maybe some evidence to support some claims. And if the ASC reaches out, we have 10 days to follow up. This is not 10 days to necessarily answer the question, but we have 10 days to give them a response on what our plan is, say. So maybe there's a request that's going to take the mill another week or two to prepare some evidence. Well, we can tell the ASC that. We can say, hey, we've heard your request. It's going to take us 20 days to get you what you need. So just be patient and we'll get it to you. And that's no problem. But if we don't respond within the 10 days, then they'll close the VR. So that's no good. So if you do need a VR, make sure you just keep an eye out for communication from myself or somebody else in SCS head office. Because if we do get some follow-up from the ASC, we'll need to engage with you within 10 days to either get the ASC what they're looking for or give them a timeline for what it's going to take us to get them the information they need. So that's the VR process. Once they've gone through the review, they will make a decision. If they approve the VR, then perfect, happy days. Whatever the issue is, we can assess compliance and we can move forward. Sometimes they'll approve a VR, but they'll put some conditions in to whether it's to show continued compliance, maybe something we have to review yearly. There's a number of things they can do, but if they approve a VR, typically we're in very good shape. If they don't approve the VR, then we're back to the non-conformance process and we have to start moving through the non-conformance process, which, as we talked about before, can be problematic with getting a quick certificate. So if you know you need a VR ahead of the audit, please let us know. If it comes up during the audit, we should jump into it as quickly as possible as soon as the closing meeting is over. Okay, so that's all I have today. I'm going to hand it over to Brian to finish up and to kick off the Q&A.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you for that presentation. That was obviously a lot of information, but really hopefully unpacking that can kind of demystify the standard and kind of explain, provide some guidance that's helpful to everyone. As you just shared, we're going to quickly just go over some takeaways here and then jump into Q&A. It's really important. It seems to be really important and valuable for feed mills to go through the pre-evaluation, pre-assessment with us up to this point. A lot of feed mills have been requesting it, asking for it, and there's high demand for that because this is such a new phenomenon, a new standard, and it really helps get them oriented and more prepared. And so as part of preparedness, making sure your business is ready for this process and for this requirement, making sure you reach out to SCS and ask questions. Make sure you look at the materials and resources that we're sharing in this webinar and we're sharing after, like the ASC Program Center, and understand if you do need a variation request based on your geography, where you're located, maybe issues related to working hours or other constraints that are kind of unique to your operation. So please do be proactive about engaging with us about that. It's our job to understand that whole world of VRs and what's available. And as you all know, October 31st will be here before we know it. So definitely important to get engaged now, get a pre-assessment scheduled or get an audit scheduled. And we are working very hard to train up and increase capacity around feed mill auditors. But it's really important to be aware of this deadline. I'm just going to share the link in the chat, but there's also a QR code here that's just to the SCS and our website, where you can also find out more. And now at this time, we can go to the next slide and open it up to questions. We received a lot of questions during this session, and we're not going to be able to get to all of them, but we're going to do our best to prioritize some of the key ones that came up. So I just wanted to touch on one question that came up. Adam, perhaps this is best directed to you, but back in 2015, there was a process of between ASC, Global Gap, and BAP of developing a combined checklist as relates to the farm standard, of course, and those standards. But have you heard of any developments to do the same as it relates to feed, kind of harmonizing these efforts for facilities out there to have a combined checklist?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's unfortunately work that is not being done. It would be great just to make everything easier, because I know there is a bit of a certification overload for a lot of companies these days. There's a lot of schemes they have to engage with. But no, there's currently, not that I'm aware of, that I've heard of yet, any combined checklists for farms seeking to do both. There are a lot of overlap, but there's not one central resource or anybody doing this work to kind of benchmark and harmonize.
Excellent. And Juan, if you're available to either share your screen as well, just want to make sure that you're on. A couple questions that are probably directed to you as well. One of the questions that came up was, how did, given, Juan, perhaps I'll direct this question to you, but given the standard is an international standard, how does the standard address legal compliance so that, legality in a certain jurisdiction or a certain country is, is examined, but also while ensuring it's some sort of global standard that everyone can comply with? Could you just maybe explain that a little bit, in general terms?
Well, about the legal compliance of the mill, we look for the local permits. There are usually several permits regarding land use, property taxes, also particular authorizations for feed mills to operate, usually regulated by the Department of Agriculture or the correspondent agency in that country. Yeah, so that's a kind of legal compliance we look at for the company level. And then, well, there's legal compliance for many of the social indicators and labor indicators also. Yeah.
Thanks, Juan. That was helpful. So another question that I wanted to direct to you, Juan, and Adam, feel free to chime in, but if a feed mill sources an ingredient from like an intercompany manufacturing location, another site, basically like part of the manufacturing basically of the feed, does that internal location also need to be, a certified, have an ASC feed certification in addition to maybe the primary site?
Yeah, go ahead, Adam. Maybe you have a clear idea of this question.
So the answer to that is no. So it's just the site that's producing whatever aqua feed is then being sold to the farm. So that final production facility is what needs to be certified. Now, that said, the due diligence still needs to extend through the supply chain. So if they're sourcing ingredients from another company, the due diligence will need to cover those ingredients. But that company itself or other mill doesn't need to be certified as long as they can show all the ingredients meet the due diligence requirements.
Okay, great. Well, this question is to you, and then Adam, feel free to chime in as well. But basically, you mentioned that it takes a team of people to support this effort for feed mills. But Juan, in your experience, who do you generally find are most critical in terms of like the roles of the personnel that you end up interacting with and supporting the process, like when you go on site?
Yeah, there's been a variety of people assigned as contact persons for the feed certification at separate companies. In some cases, it's somebody they have a certification department. So they have a whole team dedicated to certifications in general. In some cases, it's a purchasing the department or person that work for the purchasing department, because they are the ones that have to decide whether ingredients are eligible or not. They are assigned by the company to do the due diligence, which is the most critical part of this preparation for the standard, I would say. So it varies. In a recent case, it was just one person in charge, and with the help of health and safety and also the procurement people. But basically, it was one person that was in charge of quality assurance in general, but also undertook the feed certification duties.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you, Juan. We have there are a number of the questions that came through, and we're unfortunately out of time. But I'll just answer one that's really quick. That's about the gap analysis of the pre-assessment. Is that part of the 4-month process that we laid out? And the process that Adam laid out was kind of soup to nuts in terms of going under contract and getting an audit for certification. The gap analysis pre-assessment is another 2-3 month kind of a process in front of that, possibly shorter because it is desk-based, and Juan has been very busy doing those pre-assessments as well and getting to supporting industry on that effort. But yeah, it does kind of extend the timeline a bit, closer to six months or even a little bit more if you factor that in. But with that, we can wrap up the webinar. We're going to be following up with more information, and we'll make sure to provide some notes on like some of these questions that came through and some of the responses from our team. And so that would get more detailed responses back to you all. I really appreciate a lot of the questions that came through. We had 11 or 12 questions that came through, at least, that we want to address. And really, really appreciate all of your time. We are very engaged on this issue, so feel free to reach out to myself or Adam, and Juan's email is there as well. So you can get directly from our auditing team on how to best prepare for this. But thank you all for your time, and have a great day, and look forward to working with you all further on this effort. Thank you. Take care.